Hi there.
Hi,
How are you?
I'm good. You?
Good.
Well, thanks so much for coming. Let's get started.
Sounds
Uh,
great.
so first, just introduce yourself and what do you do, I guess.
Well, I'm John Berndt. I do actually a lot of different things, but I think in this context, um, the main thing that's relevant is that I've been a um, composer, performer, improviser, and organizer in experimental improvised avant-garde music since my early teens, and I'm 53 years old.
That's cool. So I guess my first question is, why do you make music, and do you have an intended, I guess, goal or objective in making music, and how do you go about accomplishing that goal if you do?
Yeah, sure. So, e- there's a lot of possible ways of coming at the first part of the question. I would say that music is relevant to me because of the unbelievable economy of means for um, uh, economy of means for being able to communicate what might be roughly called states of mind or states of being or something like that in music. Like the fact that you can, having never heard, Indian singing or something like that, walk into a concert hall and be completely sort of transported into a different, room in the mind you haven't been in before is the warrant for the emphasis on music. And I also think, in my own personal case, I'm kind of a lifelong synesthete. Like I definitely have strong synesthesia perceptions, so that I mean, usually people think about that in terms of seeing sound or whatever. And although I do experience some of that, it's also just like I find music and sound to be fairly overpowering, in a kind of like in a kind of multisensory way. So all those things I think very early on led me into being really interested in music and sound, but particularly into unusual music and sound that was like extra evocative because it was extra unfamiliar or something like that. Um, as far as like the methodology of how I um, sort of address making these things, um, I think I'm probably an unusual figure in experimental music, in the sense that I have sustained involvement in and really developed a lot of really unrelated methodologies, and I'm sort of an anti-reductionist person by nature. So I'm sort of deliberately, but it also just comes naturally to me, historically involved in lots and lots of different ways of doing things, and I sort of view it all from a standpoint of like kind of modality theory, like different types of preconditions and different types of conceptual structures bias different types of possible results. And because I'm not really a believer that the like kind of standards of performance have captured the subject matter in some intellectual sense or some practical sense, I'm real interested in unusual, methodologies. And so I guess some of the main areas that I've been focused on in my life are um, s- uh, electronic music with a really high focus on spectral considerations, and also a really high focus on kind of tuning chaotic systems and building kind of counterintuitive electronic systems across analog and digital and tape music type and spatial type approaches. Uh, I've had a ton of focus on kind of instrumental experience, like the dialectic with an instrument, like that happens in, virtuosic free improvised music, has been a big interest to me. A lot of focus on group improvisation, including for about 10 years having a group that was an active group called Second Nature, that was an orchestra that I directed, that was 100% free improvised, but had a really unusual kind of practice regime to try to open up interesting possibilities in large group improvisation stuff. And then also inventing instruments, like physical instruments, has been a big part of my life. I had my friend Neil Feather and I had for 20 years a very active group called Thus, where we uh, built and performed like a kind of a semi-improvised idiom that was built up from this orchestra of instruments that we built. And there's a bunch of other stuff. I mean, I have had a long interest in um, different types of like unusual compositional modalities. Like, for instance, I had a band for maybe 15 years called Geodesic Gnome that was kind of a super group of Baltimore experimentalists, but they performed compositions which were mainly philosophical problems as compositions, like trying to get people to play paradoxes as compositions and things like that. And then also a very different group called Multiphonic Choir that played music in this idiom that we called Afro-Germanicism, which is kind of complicated to explain. But I would say, there's a kind of a range in the music that I've done between things that are really like intimately phenomenological, like just a dialectic between a person and some sort of weird sound producing apparatus, or there's not a lot of like cultural or language obvious cultural or language levels mediating or explaining the things, all the way up to things that are like, really kind of complicated philosophical or cultural jokes that are meant to also like, uh, that are meant to like potentiate different weird types of results. I'm sort of always interested in kind of getting outside of off the reservation of what's known, etc.
Mhm. So sort of leading off of that, how do you define experimental music? Because it's obviously a sort of, I guess, ambiguous term. So how do you define it?
Yeah, so I think what's interesting about that is that there is a, experimentation as a methodology is a core part of rationalism, and and obviously scientific method is like this interplay between um, you know kind of certain axiomatic beliefs about the world, and then repeatability of experiments and stuff like that. I think experimental music functionally as a genre is probably best understood in terms of like a motivation to get out to get out of what you already are super familiar with, but that can happen on so many different registers. I mean, like, there are for sure nuanced experimental things that happen within a genre, like, you know um oh god, I'm just thinking like maybe certain like jazz records or whatever that are clearly are jazz, but also very experimental, uh, all the way to things that are really truly out of compartment. Um, so, I mean, I think it sort of represents a kind of, I think it maybe is best understood as like a kind of skeptical relationship at the level of what the possibilities of music are to the culture at large, or to the civilization as a whole, or something like that. Like, you just, the motivation is that you're not starting from the standpoint that like all the good experiences have already been cataloged, and you're also skeptical that you need a whole civilization, or that you need a whole uh, historic culture behind you to be able to do yeah, have like coherent novelty or something like that. I mean, I actually think that's a really philosophically difficult um, question. The question of like what's the what is the value of traditional cultures in relation to experimental music? I think it's a far from obvious question, but I do think that there's that there's sort of like a viewpoint where like all of known music, like if you imagine a pot of boiling water, one of the bubbles is all of known music, and experimental music is interested in the rest, or something like that.
Hmm. Um, so I guess sort of related to that, what's good music?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the thing that's most interesting to me about good music is that there's apparently no formula for its production. I think it may well be the case that as human beings um, create imitative trainable systems via neural nets and machine learning and everything, they may be able to perform this like bizarre bootstrapping rabbit trick where they are able to create formulas that they cannot understand, that can provide them with more gratifying things than they can imagine today, which will be an interestingly destabilizing and probably horrible experience for the civilization. I mean, like people, in sort of bourgeois democracy, post Enlightenment world, we tend to view ourselves as being, infinitely sentient, but it's pretty easy to prove that we're not. So building things that might gratify us a lot more than the things we already have could be a really huge problem. But we don't have that today. So at least not that I know of. So I mean, today I think there's really no formula, and I think that creates an interesting issue for taste and an interesting issue for experimental music and people involved with experimental music, because like I used to say, as the founder and co-organizer of the first 20 or so High Zero festivals in Baltimore, um, I always used to describe to people that like my highest pleasure in the context of the festival was when I would be watching sets of music that I could not myself personally determine whether or not they were any good. That's the thing that most interested me, because that's like where the action was. Like you sort of know you're having an out of compartment experience if you can't actually evaluate it,
Hmm.
which is a weird, ineffable position to take. And I wouldn't want anybody to like swallow that uncritically, but yeah. But so yeah, I mean, I think another comment about music is that I think a lot of the so-called action in m- the engagement from music, and the pleasure that it potentially gives, but also the like ability to move you or whatever. I think a lot of the action happens in. I mean, Western classical music has sort of, mapped a, a ton of territory that relates, essentially to, this idea of like chords affecting emotions or something like that. I think that there's an enormous terrain of what's evocative that lives outside of what Western music, knows how to notate. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's just the limitation of a culture or whatever. But I think like a ton of like the musical interest in hot musical forms or like soulful musical forms comes from like micromuscular, unnotatable micromuscular things that people do in performance that like the devil is like super in the details. So I mean, I think that's you can hear two different performances of like a notated composition that can be on radically different registers of engaging you, and that has to do with micromuscular things that the performers are doing that they probably can't even analytically decompose, which is also interesting. um, another thing is, which I think is related to that, is that there's this whole issue of gridding of time in experience. And I mean, obviously I come at all this stuff with a real phenomenology kind of orientation, but the I think a lot of what makes music engaging sometimes has to do with events, tension that's set up by like an imputed um, tempo, and tension that's created by things falling behind or being advanced ahead of the tempo, that then cause like some kind of different excitation or something like that. And so I'm super super interested in that, and there's a whole nother side of what I do that's I didn't mention before, that's I would say really actually kind of solidly half of what I'm involved with now, which is this concept of relabi, which is a concept that I came up with that has to do with trying to like formalize an illusion of tempo, where you kind of are like slipping the pulse so much that you're still imputing a pulse, but there really is no pulse there. And that's kind of something I am interested in, has interesting musical results, and I think is philosophically profound, but is it's kind of like an edge case of like something that's already happening in jazz, southern boogie rock, et cetera, where people are flexing relative to the pulse. So those are just some of the, I mean, I think it's heterogeneous. These are all heterogeneous things that don't reduce one to the other. And I think also, the kind of spectral delights are, kind of left out of Western music, but I think are very real. And I mean, there's a whole way that you can view harmonies in Western music as being a subset of spectra, and all that sort of stuff. So
Mhm. So I mean, you've touched on this a little bit, but I guess in what way is your music sort of, I guess, informed or influenced by your worldview or your opinions on, politics or philosophy or whatever it may be?
well, uh yeah, I mean, it's a too big a question in some ways to really be able to do in the time that we have. But I would say, pre-ideology or pre-philosophy, I would say I'm somebody who has always viewed my own personal subjective experience as being on a kind of an equivalent plane of dignity to the whole rest of the world, which is, I mean, that sounds like narcissistic megalomania or something, but I think it's a sort of more of an odd knife's edge balance. Like I'm not I'm not valuing my own subjective responses or my own um, sort of personal experience of them or something in a way that is a subset of the world. I'm viewing it kind of as being like a parallel phenomenon to the world. And I mean, there's a lot one could say about, you know, like the problems that philosophy's wrestled with relative to that since time immemorial. But I guess the short headlines is I think the self world dichotomy is a big problem, and I don't think it's resolved in any way by any philosopher. And I also think that just because the world can sort of beat it out of you doesn't mean that there's not an issue with not being able to find a boundary between the subject and the object. Um, so that for sure informs a lot of it, and probably just naturally travels along with having somewhat expanded tastes around the kinds of experiences and phenomena and structures that I would like to do or put out there or experience. I think I've always been a great fan of eccentricity because I view like social life, including the sort of normative subcultures and normative political trends and things that exist. I view them. I'm sympathetic to it all, but I do view it as being like somewhat of a somewhat of a pressure cooker for human beings. Like I think there's a lot of coercion in all directions and stuff like that, and I'm generally excited by people who are like seem to be at whatever strata of society escaping coercion. But that's complicated because we're also all interdependent and all those obvious political things. So I mean, I do sort of feel like I do sort of feel like even without getting into like having problems with authority, I do feel like you can just be excited by the exuberance of possibility and of you know variety and amongst human beings and stuff like that, and what kinds of concerns that human beings would think were worth paying attention to. I, I have a long history of being involved with that paralleled my interest in experimental music, being involved with the just various um, cultural activities that were like experiments with uh, like mind fuckery of various sorts. I was in the newest movement as a teenager, which was like a post fluxus, post situationist group, and I was really involved and active in that. And so I definitely think that probably put the final nail in the coffin of my being able to feel like the sort of official institutional and pop cultural world could possibly be all that there was. But I also have a pretty deep critique of like the limitations of you know jazz and the 20th century avant-garde and stuff like that, and of the free music world too. I mean, I love the free music world. It has been a huge part of my personal life as well as my artistic life. But I mean, I think it's good to be critical of everything, and partially because of that earlier point that there's really not like a formula for good music or for interesting experiences. And also, y- you know, it's sort of embarrassing to say, but what actually manages to engage you can change a lot over time. I mean, I tend to sort of like all the stuff I ever liked, but I can definitely see that you can find a certain thing at a certain moment in your life, and it can be really liberating, and then later on 30 years later you look back at it and you go, yeah, that was pretty good, but it wasn't quite the revelation I thought, or I don't know, something like that.
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I would say I come at it from a lot of different angles, and I also am highly influenced by the outside forces that I've been lucky enough to encounter. Like I had certain encounters. I would have probably never gotten interested in free improvised music if I hadn't just happened to encounter some really amazing improvisers at a particular moment in my life, and then that sort of opened a door that allowed me to have a hopeful horizon about all of it, which I could have easily not had if I hadn't met those people, etc.
Hmm. So I mean, I guess the last question that I sort of have prepared is, why do you like your music? And if you wouldn't say that you like your music, then why do you make it?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to sound narcissistic, but I actually really love listening to my music, which I don't do that often. But when I do, I mean, I think I think if I've accomplished anything on a personal level with music, it's that the music I've made is a really unmediated exteriorization of like some aspects of like my consciousness that when I re-experience them, I'm like shocked by how much they impact me. And it's not like a social thumbs up, thumbs down kind of situation. It's more like, oh, I really poured some shit directly out of myself somehow into this glass on the table is what it feels like. So, and that's not true of all of it. I mean, like I've played like what there are sides to my musical activity that have been really gratifying. Like I played for 10 years in an Afrobeat orchestra that played Fela Kuti's music. Had an amazing time, played some great solos. It doesn't feel that way at all. I mean, it's like it's clearly like stepping into something else. Similarly with playing with jazz musicians, which I can do for about 30 minutes before you be- become aware that I'm not a jazz musician or whatever. But I just don't have that much jazz in me. But those kinds of things are like exciting and fun and growth opportunities, but the stuff that I directly have produced, a lot of it is super super gratifying, and I think I'm shy about listening to it because I do have such an intense response to it. So maybe you could say that all of it, even though there's obviously a very public side to it all, and I've gotten good feedback from the world on it, but I mean, I think a lot of it is some sort of obscure communion with self or something like that too. So
Hmm. Well, that's all I've got. So, well, thanks so much for talking to me.
sure, can you tell me just for 2 seconds about what your project is? And
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So what I'm doing is I'm doing a lot of these interviews with lots of different types of people,
yeah,
and then I'm making various types of art in response to the interviews. And the, I guess, sort of end product, I guess, is I'm putting together, probably in the form of like a website or something like that, a collection of all the interviews I do and all the art that I make in response to them. So,
cool.
yeah.
That sounds great. It sounds like a good project. Well, I wish you luck with it, and happy to answer the questions.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye bye.
Bye. See you later.